Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final webinar in the Preparing to Pivot webinar series. This webinar is going to focus on building a pivot action plan, and we're really excited to have you join us today. We're also going to look at some of the previous webinar content and really think about what will it take to build that action plan. Before we get underway, we want to just express our gratitude and acknowledgement and really recognize the fact that we are meeting on Indigenous land and that as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And so just want to acknowledge the land and the wisdom that we're meeting on today. We also want to thank our webinar series hosts, the United Way of Leeds and Grenville, Every Kid in Our Communities of Leeds and Grenville, and the RBC Foundation. This series has been put together with the advice of the United Way and Every Kid in Our Communities. And we're really grateful for their support and their encouragement for this webinar series, and also really grateful for meeting all of you. As I mentioned, this is the fourth in the series. We've spent some time over the last number of weeks taking stock of what has happened, from March until now during the pandemic. We've spent some time really thinking about how that has transformed the way we collaborate with one another and moving to more virtual environment. We've also spent a bit of time thinking about how we're going to re-engage. So now as we're hitting that September rush and we're kind of getting into the rhythm of the fall, some of you may have returned to workplaces or to school environments. Others of you are still working remotely. What does that mean from an engagement perspective? And really this session is looking at building the plan going forward into, the next 6 months, the next year. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they said that they were planning all the way to December of 2021. So, what are the time horizons that you're working with? And then the final thing that will be available to those of you that are members of the United Way of Leeds and Grenville is a 1-hour coaching session. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar today. So let's tell you a little bit about me. I'm Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I lead the collaborative leadership portfolio at Tamarack within the Learning Center. And for those of you that don't know Tamarack or who are joining us for the first time, Tamarack has 2 areas that we focus on. One are the 5 interconnected practices, which really help change makers become more effective and lead impactful community change. And then the other area that we focus on is to support local leaders in reducing poverty, deepening community, and improving youth futures. And so those are the areas that we're focusing on today. So I've got a little bit of an interactive activity for you. And this is really kind of challenging you to think about superheroes. And so it's not only about the superhero, but the power that they bring to their work. And, if you're anything like me, I've just come off of 2 weeks vacation, and this week is an incredibly busy week as we're scaling back up our work at Tamarack. So what superpower do I hope for? I actually think I would like to have the spidey sense, right? The spidey sense is really an opportunity to not only do the work and kind of move like a spider through the work this week, but also kind of that ability to anticipate a little bit the future. So what superpower do you think you would like to have at the moment? And put it into the chat box. And so we'll see. So someone said already they're a woman, so that is a superpower. So thanks for that, Jillian, and that comment in the chat box. And if others want to kind of put their superpowers in the chat box. I have to say that when I looked at this, I wasn't sure of all of them, but I do know that, you know, Superman has the ability to jump tall buildings in a single bound, and, you know, the Green Lantern has the ability to look into the future, and Trish says reading minds, and Victoria says seeing into the future, and Duncan commented that ability to see into the future would be a great sense to have right now. And I think it's true. The golden lasso of truth, oh, that's an interesting one. That would be an interesting superpower to have. The Jedi's ability. So some of you are going beyond this little picture, but the Jedi ability to wield interesting powers, those are really great superpowers to have as well. And so, you know, I when I was thinking about this webinar, I was thinking, you know, many of us bring a lot of these superpowers into our work on a daily basis. And, you know, there seems to be this kind of common thread about the ability to see the future. And I think, you know, that's one that's kind of appropriate right now, because we're in these unstable times, right? We're, you know, still trying to navigate our way through the pandemic. We've seen lots of big changes in the environment, and, you know, even in terms of organizational content and organizational approaches, it's still a little bit wobbly out there in terms of our the work that we're doing. So if we go on to the next slide, so thanks everybody for responding. We're going to really focus on the pivot action plan. And so here are the goals for the webinar today: to begin the process of thinking about it, and maybe even take you through some exercises where you can build your pivot action plan, to look at some of the things that we've done in previous webinars and really kind of consider how they relate. It's an opportunity for you to kind of provide some feedback and then develop a path going forward. So the disruptive change, we've talked about this in the last couple of webinars, but this slide I think is a really interesting one when we think about the impacts of COVID-19 on our work and our personal lives. And so we started off maybe kind of in the fear zone, and, you know, we saw that kind of represent itself in a kind of cross community, in a way that folks were, you know, buying toilet paper and, you know, storing up on supplies. And so that's a little bit of that panic buying. And then we kind of have been in the learning zone. So this series of webinars have begun to kind of take us into learning. And what we've seen at Tamarack a bit more is that people are really engaging with us in our opportunities for learning that we've been hosting. So more and more of us over the course of the summer have gotten more into learning. We might have been learning, you know, around our collaborative tables, or learning about new ways of working, engaging with, you know, working remotely. And so now we're starting to lean into this growth zone, right? And to say, you know, this is life, but we're going to now start to plan forward, right? We're going to begin to develop that clear picture of what's next. On the next slide, and those of you that have participated on these webinars in the past, you've seen that we've identified that there are 3 potential futures that we might be encountering. And the futures are that we return to the old equilibrium, that we might find this new equilibrium of developing services and programs. At Tamarack, we're talking about the new equilibrium in a way that we're doing many more things online and many more workshops and webinars digitally, or that there will be this kind of ongoing disequilibrium. And I think probably the future looks more like finding a bit of a new equilibrium, at least in the short term, but also recognizing that there will be this kind of disequilibrium kind of moving forward. And so what does that mean for all of us? The next slide kind of helps you think about the ways that we can navigate disruptive times. And this comes from a paper that Tamarack published and I wrote a couple of months ago. And if you think about the building resiliency, right, it's about building into our competencies and into our skill sets, the ability to monitor and respond to changing community dynamics, the capacity to be more flexible and responsive, and to really consider those opportunities to collaborate more effectively, and to kind of move beyond incremental change to really focusing or refocusing on our core purpose and what's driving our work forward. And to also, as we're going to learn today, to kind of focus on those things that maybe aren't working quite as well, and how do we, at this time, kind of release them. And so when we think about, building a pivot action plan, the pivot action plan should lean into that kind of third set of building resiliency, the third set of boxes on this slide, and really thinking about, okay, so what are the ways that we can move forward? Another way to think about this is, how do we make innovation stick? Because, over the course of the last 3 webinars that we've had together, you all have shared some of the innovative approaches that you've been building into your work. I mean, just imagine back in March, when the pandemic first kind of made us all close down our organizations and go to working in a more remote environment. There's lots of innovation that came through that process. And so how do we take the lessons that we've learned, the adaptability of, going from going into the office every day to now working remotely and hosting meetings remotely and building our collaborative tables remotely and sharing information remotely? What's the innovative practices that we've brought into our kind of day-to-day work? And how do we make that kind of innovation stick beyond this moment in time? And so this comes from a paper by Al Admansky around innovation. And he talks a little bit about, this notion of unifying innovation across our collaborative or across our movement. And so it really is important to have, as we talked about in the webinar around collaboration, to have this kind of conversation with folks around our collaborative table about what we did well, and where we didn't succeed, where we missed some opportunities, and what are the things that we want to continue to carry forward as we move into the resilience phase, to really look at what's happening within popular culture. And so how are people in our communities being engaged differently, and what are we what are some of the trends that we're witnessing across our broader community of Leeds, Grenville, and Kingston, Lennox, and Addington? Where's politics going? And so we're starting to see some signals both at the federal level and at the provincial levels in terms of some shifts into the next phase of the pandemic. And so what does that mean? And we're even seeing those shifts at the local level. And so how do we pay attention to those and the policies that are, going to impact us in this kind of next phase of our work? And then what's the learning curve that we have to pay attention to? And so that kind of sets the context for, beginning to move into the planning phase for this pivot. And so what we'd love you to do is to maybe put some questions that those kind of contextual slides raise for you. And we'll circle back to those questions, but we invite you to put them into the chat box. And in a couple of minutes, I'll come back to them. But I just want to set a little bit more context for you in terms of the pivot action plan. So for those of you that have been part of this webinar series, you know that a lot of what we've been doing is really taking stock. And so that was the part of the first webinar in this series. And I think that, the set of questions that we shared with you in each of the webinars is so important not to miss the moments of innovation that have occurred. And so this taking stock exercise is such a good one, and it's one that we've repeated in each of these webinars. And so it's about this reflection about what we've accomplished, And some of it is about what we individually have accomplished, right? So there's been so much that has, so have you adapted well to working remotely? Have you created new partnerships? Have you been able to read more and reflect more and to really think more about, the pandemic? Have you been able to keep your family bubble, safe and contained? So thinking about what you've accomplished, what opportunities you might have missed, and some of the challenges that you might have encountered. So individual reflection is critical, but we also have that kind of collective reflection that's really critical in terms of the taking stock exercise. And if we move on to the next slide, there's some kind of these collective questions that again, help you not only go to the first level, but go a little bit deeper in terms of taking stock. When we think about the pivot action plan, that reflection is really important as almost like a precursor to moving into this pivot action plan. And so the next couple of slides really start to bring you into thinking about the building of the pivot action plan. And I'm going to share with you two approaches that I have uncovered that I think they look at things they look at building a pivot action plan from two different lenses. And so if we go to the next slide, we can begin to see again, that kind of critical thinking as a starting point. So in your pivot action planning process, you want to look at what's the most critical challenge. So not only have we taken stock, but what's the most critical challenge that's facing our organization right now? And this is, I think, important, or your collaborative. So really think about, okay, so, a couple of webinars ago, we were talking to every kid in our community, and they were saying, one of the critical challenges that we're seeing right now is that while we're meeting well and, getting really organized, we're seeing a drop off in engagement. And so then how do we move those challenges together? Jillian is saying that a critical challenge that her organization is facing currently is getting timely access to services from their client's perspective. And so what makes this a challenge, and what would you like to change? And so those are important questions to consider as we begin to think about planning forward. So the first model that I want to present to you comes from a group called RSA. And this is a planning in a crisis model. And what's really interesting about this model is that it looks at both items during a crisis and also post-crisis. And it gives you an opportunity to think about what are things that we have stopped or that we can let go of? What do we need to restart? So that's around our old practice. So the practice almost pre-pandemic. And then as we move kind of into this post-pandemic things, what are the things that we started that we can now find an opportunity to possibly end them? So as we pivot back from, working remotely back to meeting in a workplace, what are some of the things that we did to respond to working remotely that we can end because we're no longer working remotely? And then what are some of the things that we need to amplify? So we learned, that working remotely, so I'll take a Tamarack example for you. Working remotely, we needed to have far more and regular conversations with our staff at Tamarack to talk about, our ongoing finances in the organization, how we were planning together, and some issues that were being raised because of the pandemic, and also the health and wellness of our staff team. So some of those things we could end, but others we might need to amplify as we go into this new phase. And so maybe a little bit less on health and wellness of our staff team, but more on planning forward and really focusing on, financial implications for our organization. And Tamarac's a remote organization, so we will continue to kind of think about the remote environment. So this is a really great kind of tool to kind of help you think about, both the work that happened pre-COVID, the work that we're now going into this next phase of, and you can actually say, okay, so for the next 6 months, or you can put a time horizon onto this tool. And so this is one way of looking at it. And it's kind of looking at what practices we're seeing in communities and in institutions and in policies. And I saw that Duncan put a link into the chat box around this resource. The second a way of looking at this is another kind of thing. It's called a strategy development zones canvas. And so this comes from a blog by our colleague Cameron Norman, who runs an organization and a consulting firm called Sense, and he talks about this and in detail in the blog. But he says, okay, so what are the things that we saw in the blue ocean, which are the opportunities? What do we see in the red ocean, which is the crowded marketplace with lots of competitors and, just kind of things that, we want to outperform and beat the competition? Where are the things that we might put in this Gulf Stream drift? So areas of innovation that might have straddled the red zone and the red ocean and the blue ocean opportunities. And then what are the things that we might find in the green forest? Those are the things, the innovations that we might want to seed. So some of us might really like the planning in crisis way of thinking of building our pivot plan. Others of us might lean into this planning for opportunity approach in terms of developing our pivot plan. They are, neither one is complete. It's really what is your preference and what is your way of wanting to focus into the future. And so we've given you kind of two ways of considering how you might build your pivot plan for both your organization and or your collaborative. And in this PowerPoint, as you will see, we've kind of given you, we've taken the two ways of looking at this and then have built planning tools for you. So you can download the slide when you get the slide deck post-webinar, and then you can start to kind of fill in the boxes in terms of the RSA model, or if you go to the next slide, in terms of the strategy development zones model. Again, it's an opportunity for you to kind of think about, okay, so which model do we prefer in terms of building our pivot plan, and which one would we work on? It might be, if you have extra time, not that a lot of people have extra time right now, it might be interesting to do one and then do the other one and see where you land, right? That would be something that I would probably take on. I'm not suggesting that everybody has, but it is kind of interesting to think that there are two models that can really help you in terms of your pivoting. Molly just actually put something in the chat box that I found kind of a interesting comment, or no, Mary Lynn, sorry about that. The challenges of COVID have brought a greater awareness on the vital role of volunteers that volunteers play in our economic and social well-being of our community. The Volunteer Center will focus on growth and amplify awareness of the value of volunteerism going forward. Really interesting, Mary Lynn. Thanks for that comment. And I think, it is true that, colleagues and I are writing a paper that will come out probably in October. And what we've looked at during the course of the pandemic is almost 3 different approaches to leadership that we've been witnessing in our community. And one approach is this caremongering approach that Mary Lynn is talking about. And that's really where volunteers have stepped up and responded really quickly to community needs. And sometimes it's been, fairly kind of just not even organized. It's been kind of these clusters of people saying, hey, I have a need, and another person stepping in and saying, hey, I can meet that need. So that caremongering approach we've seen really emerge in lots of communities across Canada over the last little while. And then we've also seen this growth and development of collaboratives and collaborative leadership in communities. Again, many of us do that as part of our work, but some of us do it as part of our volunteering commitment in the community. And then what we're also going to be talking about in this paper is this third level of looking at the system and how do we begin to shift the system and systems leadership. So look for that paper. We'll send it out to everybody on the mailing list once it's published. And so these two approaches can really help you kind of think about your pivot plan in a concrete kind of way. And so thanks everybody for putting comments and suggestions in. The next couple of slides really take us through some of the kind of slides that we've already talked about. But we wanted to remind you that they're both in the workbook, but in the previous webinars. And they can really help you set the kind of context for building your pivot plan. And so if you remember in our Taking Stock webinar, we really focused on the core purpose of the organization. We spent some time kind of thinking about these questions. But really now, as we're beginning to build our pivot plan, we want to focus on the regenerate resilience question, right? How can we make and sustain meaningful change? And so for those of you that participated in those webinars, we took you through a couple of exercises on the next two slides. The first exercise really helped you kind of refocus on that core purpose. And so some of you may have already done this exercise, and it becomes really essential as you're building your pivot plan. So the core purpose, here's a great little resource to help you kind of refocus on your core purpose. And as you've gone through the three webinars in this series, it might have shifted a little bit. And even after today, you might revisit it and rethink, okay, how might we as an organization or a collaborative make some additional changes to this? And then we had you kind of think about on the next slide, you know, your core capabilities and what are the things that you want to be able to address post-pandemic. And so really looking at things like your tangible assets, your intangible assets, the people that you're connected to, whether they're the staff on your team, the board members that are affiliated with your organization, the staff around the collaborative table or the participants around the collaborative table, or the funders and government relationships that you have. So think about people not only in a very narrow sense, but kind of in a very broad sense. And then the processes. So what are the capabilities that you want to continue to draw from or build up as we shift into this post-pandemic kind of planning, this pivoting and planning process. And so then we kind of looked at collaboration. Again, we're going to focus in terms of building your pivot plan on the regenerate resilience question, which is how can we use our collaborations across sectors to become more transformative, right? So we know that lots of collaborations that we have in our communities are maybe are meeting, you know, direct needs of folks in our communities, but there's a reason, there's an opportunity here in terms of thinking about the shifting political dynamics that are happening in our communities. So how can we, you know, really look at those opportunities as, you know, transforming society? I think I was reading recently that on the federal government, the Liberal Party agenda for their strategic planning session, they're talking about universal basic income. And can you imagine how that's going to shift the work that we do if that goes from a conversation into something that is more focused? And so then if that's a transformative shift that we're coming into, what does that look like for our organizations, and what's the potential implications, for Leeds and Grenville and for the Kingston area if that were to, and then how do we, if that's a priority for us, how do we inform that? How do we get ourselves ready for that? And what might that look like? Those are things that you might think about as you build into the pivot plan. And we kind of shared with you a really interesting tool, which is to look at, the strengths and the gaps, both in your organization and collaborative, but also have this opportunity to look inward, but also look outward, right? And so this was a great tool that we presented in the webinar around reimagining collaboration. And it's so important. And I think what I've seen in some of the comments already in the chat box is that collaboration, how do we engage more volunteers, or how do we lift up, as Mary Lynn said, lift up the role of volunteers and the impact of volunteers in our community as we go forward in the next phase of developing our pivot plan. So we also shared with you in terms of the engagement webinar, again, thinking through, this notion of building trust as we pivot into the next phase of this work, and really providing our community with this kind of human person-to-person connection. Because what we've seen during COVID is that we're far more detached from one another, and we're seeing people via Zoom screens, but not making, that face-to-face connection and meeting in small groups and things like that. And so how do we continue to find ways to build in social and emotional rituals as we, build our pivot plan going forward? And so we shared with you in that webinar some tools. And so in terms of reinventing engagement, we kind of broke down the core folks that we're wanting to re-engage with, and really invited you to kind of consider how to do that more effectively, and how to spend some time kind of having some perspective around that. We also asked you to think about things like developing kind of the stories of your participants going forward, and really thinking about, where the problem areas are, how do we build those kind of interpersonal connections that are really critical, and creating those kind of moments of celebration and re-engagement that go a little bit deeper. So it's more than just welcoming people back to the office. Maybe it's doing a ribbon cutting, oh, our office is reopening, let's gather together, socially distance, and cut the ribbon, and then all walk through the door together in a row. So how do we create a moment that matters? What are the tokens of safety and trust that we're going to rebuild in this reinventing engagement? And then how do we create the context where people can give us some feedback about what worked for them and what didn't necessarily work for them? And we provided you, in thinking about engagement, with a number of different kinds of tools. One tool was to look at the engagement highlights and lowlights. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that, and really think about, okay, so what happened for, different partners that are affiliated with our organizations, or different partners that are affiliated with our collaboratives? What were the things that we did really well before the pandemic? What were the things that we did really well during the pandemic? And what did we do really well after? And what were some of the things that we didn't do quite as well? And you can almost develop this kind of timeline of ways of engagement. We also provided you with a tool that helped you kind of consider some steps and build in some practical steps that would be really supportive in terms of building engagement going forward. And the next slide kind of gives you that tool. And so how do you create those elements of interaction, and what are the things in terms of providing safety and trust? Those are the two critical things in terms of reimagining engagement. And then the final tool that we really spent some time with in the engagement webinar was to develop these storyboards. And I remember, during that webinar that someone noted at the end of the webinar that they really liked the storyboard. And so some of you may have already done this, but I think it's a great way of kind of considering different partners, or actually going to the level of thinking about individuals and specific people, and what would we do in terms of really creating their awareness and then re-engaging them in an effective way. In each of the previous webinars, we spent some time refining approaches and took you through a prototyping process. And I think, if you have done, the webinars in sequence, you probably have identified a prototype for each of the 3 areas or 3 previous webinars. Some of you might have been so busy in your work that you haven't been able to get this piece of work done. But I would encourage you, as you begin to really consider your pivot plan going forward, to really think about, okay, so around our core purpose and the core pieces of work that we do, what's a prototype that I'd like to now build into planning forward? Around collaboration, what's something that we would like to prototype in a new way, given what we've done in terms of those exercises that really help us kind of build back a better collaborative process that's more engaging, that's more leaderful, that really helps people navigate this next phase of the pandemic and the pivoting process? What's an engagement prototype that we would like to kind of build forward? And what I've been thinking about a lot during this webinar series is that even though we don't necessarily fully follow the prototyping process, we actually, in our organizations, build, and in our collaboratives, build prototypes all the time. And it's kind of like, hey, here's a new idea. Let's test that, right? Let's test doing online workshops. At Tamarack, we moved from, webinars that were relatively random to doing weekly webinars, right? That were open to our members. And that actually gave us a different kind of outcome. People got into the rhythm of it. They started having an expectation, and people would sign up for multiple webinars. And it actually gave us much more of a planning calendar going forward. And we knew who was allocated to which things. So we prototyped, we moved from random webinars to weekly webinars, and then we started to reflect on, okay, so let's allocate the weekly webinars to different people with different kinds of responsibilities, and that gave us much more of a planning process around it. So I'm just saying that the prototyping process is something that we, in our organizations and collaboratives, fall into naturally. I do think, though, if we were to kind of follow these 7 steps with more intentionality, we would actually get to better outcomes, right? And we would be able to test and learn things. And, maybe if these weekly webinars, we hosted them and we didn't get any response, then we could say, okay, moving forward, maybe weekly webinars aren't the right thing to do. So the prototyping process can be very helpful in terms of kind of considering, those prototypes and putting a little bit more flesh to the skin and bones of the prototype. And then we also provided you with a way of kind of thinking about a prototype starter that takes those 7 steps in one way and puts it together in terms of your kind of really thinking more intentionally about developing prototypes. And so all of this, we kind of took you through the reasons why we want to build a pivot plan. What is the context in which we're working now? Took you quickly through the 3 webinars and highlighted some of the key tools and resources. The next couple of minutes, we just want to kind of talk to you about building your pivot plan as a prototype, right? And so this is one way of considering this kind of bigger prototype. And so here are the steps that you can follow. So you want to determine what you want to focus on, you, your organization, or your collaborative. And so as I have taken you through the tools, it's kind of refining your capabilities, reimagining collaboration, reinventing engagement, and then thinking about the prototype development process, really kind of considering that from the perspective of the core purpose of your organization as the foundation to building your pivot plan, right? So it all kind of goes back to that core purpose. Has your core purpose as an organization or a collaborative, has it shifted during the pandemic period? And what do you think, how do you think, if you're kind of leaning forward, what do you think some of those additional shifts are that you might see coming your way, whether you're a United Way or you're a community collaborative like Every Kid in Our Community, or a housing collaborative? What are you starting to see pop up in, in the conversations that are happening both on social media, with local government, within funder circles, within your own circles, within other organizations? What are some of those conversations, and how might they shift the core purpose of your work from an opportunity perspective? And then you want to kind of think about how to plan. And I'm suggesting, you can use as a tool the planning in a crisis form, or you can use the planning for opportunity form as you're moving forward. And so the next 3 slides really kind of take you through this, the prototyping process, to really kind of consider it, but then taking the idea and really thinking about, okay, so what's the idea? What's the big idea that we want to kind of follow around our core purpose? So what's the thing that we want to really lean into? And how will we test it? So using the prototyping process for that, then moving on to thinking about, okay, so do we feel more comfortable using the RSA planning in a crisis form, which is the next slide, or do we feel more comfortable using the planning for opportunity slide as we go forward? And so all of them are available to you. And each, one of the things that I think is important is to think about, okay, so what works best for us in terms of, either our organization and what we have going forward, or our collaborative table and what we have going forward for our collaborative table. And so, we're giving you lots of tools and resources to be really reflective in this process and to be able to test it out. So a prototype might be for you, okay, so we want to develop our pivot plan as the prototype, right? And so if we go back a couple of slides, Duncan, one more. If we said, okay, our idea, one more, go forward one more. If we, our idea is to build our pivot plan for our collaborative planning table. And so our pivot plan, the idea is that we want to be able to plan forward from September to March 2021. Let's say that's the time frame that you're working in. So you want to be kind of thinking about the idea. So what's the question? How can we effectively meet the needs of the folks that we're serving during this time of still working remotely and still not having a full access to services? So you kind of take the question and you pull the question out and you think about, okay, so what are the assumptions or hypotheses that we will test in terms of the question? Well, the hypothesis is that, people are still feeling the impact of COVID. Folks are still going to be working in remote work environments. Our access to communications is still going to be challenged. We're still going to have to connect with people via Zoom and via other ways. So you put your assumptions and hypotheses there. What's the prototype? Well, a prototype might be that we're now going to try to really work with folks in a way that utilizes as many functions of Zoom as possible, right? And we're going to connect with people using that, and we're going to set up a thing of monthly check-ins, might be the prototype. So we're going to do monthly check-ins as a way of doing the service, and then the evidence that we'll collect. And so you can use this in terms of really building out your plan. And then if you go to the next slide, and you say, hey, we really want to use the RSA as a way of thinking about it, this is a great way of kind of saying, okay, these are the things that we're going to let go. These are the things that we started during the crisis, but now are going to end. Here's what we're going to amplify for the next 7 or 8 months that is the duration of this project. And here are some of the things that we had as our previous practices that we didn't put into place, but we're now going to restart them. So those are ways of kind of building a pivot action plan. We've given you lots of really great tools. What we want you to do now is to kind of consider these resources and to go back to your organizations and your collaboratives and just begin to put some of these practices in place. But we're not going to leave you alone. We have the opportunity for doing some coaching post this webinar series, because I think one of the things that the United Way and every kid in our communities recognized is that this is kind of hard work, and that you might need some support to, you know, put some of these tools into practice. And one of the things that we've learned at Tamarack as we do community coaching is just that ability to have a facilitated reflection session can be very instrumental to get people to move forward in their thinking and in their development. And so we have this opportunity for you to develop, to engage in a coaching session. We're going to do coaching sessions between now and October 15th. And the way to secure a coaching session is to just send me an email. And so you have all the details here. And what would be helpful in that email is just to frame the question that you might have and that you might want to focus on, whether it's around engagement, whether it's around collaboration, whether it's around building the pivot plan. And what we'll do is we'll set up a 1-hour session. It can be for you as an individual, or it can be for your collaborative or for your organization. You can bring, you know, yourself, or you can bring some members of the collaborative table with you, or you can bring some of your team members within your organization, or if you're in the planning process, maybe even some board members if you'd like to engage them. And so the coaching session is an hour in length, and it's going to really focus on either a post-pandemic prototype that you'd like to launch, or a pivot plan. And so we'll test it to see, you know, October 15th is kind of our end deadline, but if we need to extend that deadline, we have some flexibility around that, because it's a pretty quick deadline, but it gives you a month. So that's what we hope to do in terms of providing some support for you moving forward. So that's the content for the webinar today. What I'd like to do now is ask if there are any questions or any reflections that you have in terms of the content. We kind of went through it relatively quickly, but we wanted to provide lots of time on this webinar to really invite you to send some questions forward. And so Duncan, I wonder if there are either any reflections that you've seen that you want to highlight, or any questions that have come forward.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks for everyone for providing your questions and comments. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to add them into the chat box or the Q&A panel. Our first reflection comes from Lorna, and they say, our collaborative is even more critical than before the beginning of the pandemic. Many participants in the area are working very closely together, supporting children, youth, and their families. So that's a bit of a shift there, that the work that's already being done is now more important than ever.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, Lorna, what I would suggest that you do as a collaborative, because we've seen this pattern emerge across a lot of collaboratives in terms of our work at Tamarack. What is it specifically that the collaborative has focused on over the course of the pandemic, and what are the things that you want to bring forward in this next phase of your work, right? So, have you focused on being more effective as a collaborative? Have you focused on a new service or program? Have you focused on, looking at how different partners around the collaborative table have provided supports to one another? So what is it specifically that you focused on? What have you done really well? Why is it more important? That would be the question that I would ask. What is it that makes that collaborative even more important? From the perspectives of the members of the collaborative, and then how do you build that into your pivot plan? So that would be a way of kind of focusing forward. So do a little bit of that reflection. Has the core purpose shifted at all? And then focusing forward over the next 6 to 8 months, what would that look like going forward? So thanks for that, Lorna. Duncan.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Our next question is about the Strategy Development Zone campus, and it had to do with the Gulfstream Drift section and then the Green Forest. And it's like, how can you tell the difference between kind of creating shared value within a marketplace and competition when it comes to new innovations and programs?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because sometimes you will see things that are on the surface competitive, right? And I think that there is value in having competitive things, but what you want to do is you want to say, okay, so we have these kinds of programs and services being delivered in our community. On the surface, they look competitive, but what's unique about them? And then how do we leverage that uniqueness as a collaborative, or as, a set of organizations delivering services? So there's a great tool and a resource done by the Forum for Youth Investment called Mapping Moving Trains. And we'll add that as a resource in the post-webinar email. And the Mapping Moving Trains really is a great tool for people around a collaborative table, or organizations around a collaborative table, because it helps you kind of identify all the, let's say you're a collaborative table that's delivering programs and services for youth, right? And so you have people identify individually who's their key target, what are the hours of their service, and what are the key components of their service. And then you start to map it across, let's say, a week grid or a month grid for a community. And you begin to see where there are some real strengths in the community in terms of the services that are being delivered, but also gaps. And so that little bit of strengths and gaps analysis helps you kind of move forward. So on the surface, we might think it's competitive, but then when we go one step deeper and delve into it, we might actually see that there are lots of places where we are very collaborative and we're meeting the needs of participants in a way that we've never known before. But there's also some gaps. And so that then allows us to consider, okay, so maybe, this partner doesn't need to deliver this service because we have some real strengths, but we could shift our services, collective services, in a way that meets some of the gaps.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. To what extent should the community members themselves be engaged in that sort of analysis when it comes to talking not only about collaboration between organizations, but with the community itself?
Yeah, so that's again a really great question. I think my answer to that question would be it would depend. It depends for me on how much their engagement would lead to shifts. And so what is the hope of your table, your organization, in terms of the engagement? So there is we often use at Tamarack the engagement spectrum the International Association for Public Participation's engagement spectrum. And so we want to kind of think about, okay, so on this engagement spectrum, and it goes all the way from inform to empower, where does our engagement sit as a collaborative or as an organization on this engagement spectrum? And then what's our promise to the public? And so if we're just engaging them to inform them about a process, you know, what would that look like in terms of providing them with the right kind of information at the right time in the right way? If it is something that's truly going to have people, people's input make a real difference, and you really want to co-design and empower people, then that's, you know, really critical in terms of thinking about then how do we engage them and what might that look like. So depending on what you're trying to do, it's where you want to land, where you're going to sit on the engagement spectrum, and then what's your promise to the public in terms of the engagement spectrum. So Duncan, do we have time for one more question, or are we almost coming to the end of our time here?
I think we're just at the end of our time here, Liz. So yeah, thanks again for everyone for sharing your thoughts and questions. And we'll be sure to share out the comments and resources linked in chat in the post-webinar email.
Great. So Marg is just saying that she has had some aha moments. So thank you, Marg, for that comment. And so I look forward to meeting some of you in 1-hour coaching sessions going forward. And please feel free to reach out to me when you think it's appropriate for your team. We can schedule them now. So even if you say, I don't think we're going to be ready until, let's say, the middle of October, please do schedule those calls now, because my calendar gets a little full. And so if you can schedule them now and work towards them, I do think it's a great opportunity. So Trish from the United Way has sent a little note in the chat box thanking everyone for participating in this series. And I want to echo Trish's comments and thank everyone. And I look forward to connecting with you. Here are some additional resources for you. And we hope that you will lean into those resources and follow up with them. But I also look forward to connecting with many of you over the course of the next month.